Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and meticulously unpack one of history's most fascinating and definitely most controversial theories. We are talking about the idea that Jesus Christ spent his youth studying in India. Honestly, it's a story that sounds straight out of a sprawling adventure novel, right? A young Jesus leaving ancient Judea, trekking across the treacherous Silk Road, learning from Buddhist monks high up in the Himalayas, and engaging directly with Hindu sages. So today, we're going to explore exactly where this mind-bending theory comes from, the ancient texts it relies on, and what mainstream scholars actually have to say about the whole thing.
Here is the roadmap for our historical detective journey today. We'll be hitting 1. The 18 missing years. 2. Enter Nicholas Notovich. 3. Text and local legends. 4. Parallels in the teachings. 5. The scholarly consensus. And finally, 6. The power of a myth. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The 18 missing years. The biblical silence.
We really have to begin with this massive, glaring blank spot in what is arguably the most famous biography ever written. You've got a 12-year-old prodigy debating in the temple, and then nothing. Total radio silence. He suddenly emerges again as a 30-year-old minister getting baptized in the River Jordan. So where was he for 18 years? The canonical Gospels give us absolutely no continuous account of his teens and 20s, and this narrative vacuum has puzzled theologians and historians for centuries. It's effectively acted as this giant blank canvas for a whole multitude of theories to spring up. Moving on to Section 2. Enter Nicholas Notovich, the Russian discovery. To fill that 18-year void, a whole parade of historical detectives and spiritual seekers have stepped forward over the last century or so. You know, this theory isn't just some recent internet phenomenon. It has a surprisingly rich history. In 1894, you had Nicholas Notovich claiming to find scrolls in Ladakh. Then in 1908, Levi H. Dowron wrote The Aquarian Gospel. By 1922, Swami Abhidhandana claimed to corroborate Notovich's findings. A few years later, in 1925, Nicholas Roerich documented similar Himalayan legends. And much later, in 1983, Holger Kirsten kind of synthesized it all in his wildly popular book, Jesus Lived in India. This idea has captivated people for well over 100 years. But to understand it, we really have to look at the man who started it all. It all kicked off with this Russian journalist named Nicholas Notovich. Back in 1887, Notovich was traveling through the highlands of Ladakh. Well, according to his 1894 book, anyway, he broke his leg and was forced to recover at the remote Humus monastery. And while he was laid up there, he claimed local lamas actually showed him and translated for him these ancient Tibetan and Pali scrolls. They detailed the life of a prophet named Saint Isa, and in his published work, Notovich boldly argued that Isa was in fact Jesus Christ. According to the text Notovich supposedly translated, Isa followed a very specific, incredible route. The story goes that at age 13, which, by the way, is the exact age an Israelite should traditionally take a wife, Isa instead leaves Jerusalem with a merchant caravan. He crosses the Sind, settles among the Aryas, and spends years rigorously studying the ancient Vedas in holy Indian cities like Puri, Rajgir, and Benares. And a really crucial detail here is that the text claims he completely rejected the caste system and denounced idolatry. He was essentially preaching radical social reform to the lower castes before finally heading home to Palestine right around the age of 29. All right, Section 3, Texts and Local Legends, Traces in the East. Now, the modern narrative doesn't just rely on Notovich's very controversial scrolls. It also pulls heavily from local legends and ancient texts across India and the Himalayas. Proponents get really enthusiastic about an ancient Hindu text called the Bhavishya Purana. Within its pages, there's the striking episode where the Indian king Salavana meets a fair-skinned sage dressed all in white. This sage calls himself Isha Putra, literally meaning son of God, born of a virgin, and identifies his name as Isha Masiha, which, you have to admit, sounds remarkably close to Jesus the Messiah. Furthermore, from the highlands of Tibet all the way down to the Kashmir Valley, there's this whole network of regional folklore that supposedly preserves the memory of this Western prophet. You've got the Hemis Monastery, the alleged home of the original scrolls. You have the Nathanama Valley, which are Hindu texts referencing a wise traveler named Isa. Geography even plays a role. There are actual bodies of water named the Pond of Isa in both Leh and Kabul. And finally, there's the famous Rosa Bal Shrine, an unassuming tomb in Kashmir belonging to a prophet named Uz Asaf. And that brings us to a massive pivot, because the theory doesn't always stop at just the missing years. Some theorists, notably Holger Kirsten in the 1980s, take it a huge step further. They propose a wild post-crucifixion narrative where Jesus actually survives the cross, migrates back east, and lives out his days in Srinagar, Kashmir. They link him directly to that Rosabal shrine we just mentioned, arguing that the prophet buried there, Yuzasaf, is simply an evolution of Buddhist terms that eventually came to represent Jesus himself. Let's look at Section 4, Parallels in the Teachings. East meets West. Leaving the geography and the historical tracing aside for a second, let's look at the philosophical core. Why is this series so compelling to so many people? Well, when you place their core teachings side by side, it looks like a direct philosophical mirroring. Jesus famously taught, "Do to others what you would have them do to you." Meanwhile, the Buddha taught, "Consider others as yourself." This brilliantly illustrates the striking ethical similarities between the two figures. They're separated by centuries, yet seemingly completely united in their message of empathy. And you see this again with their radical critiques of materialism and external ritual. Jesus taught that the kingdom of God is within you, while constantly warning against the corrupting nature of wealth. Similarly, the Buddha taught that peace comes from within, and insisted that the root of suffering is attachment. Both of them were actively directing their followers away from outward displays of religion and toward this intense internal spiritual purification. The parallels actually go much deeper into their overarching spiritual frameworks. Both emphasized absolutely boundless compassion. Both intentionally sent out disciples to spread their teachings far and wide. Both faced these elaborate, legendary temptations from a dark figure in the wilderness, the devil for Jesus and Mara, the demon of temptation, for the Buddha. And both heavily preached nonviolence and turning the other cheek. To proponents of the India theory, these profound overlaps aren't just coincidences. They suggest a direct exchange of ideas, positing that Jesus actively integrated Eastern philosophy into his Judean ministry. Which brings us to Section 5, the scholarly consensus, the skeptic's corner. Now, let's move to the other side of the courtroom. It builds a completely different perspective when we look at this through the rigorous lens of modern academia. It's time to put on our critical thinking hats and ask the million-dollar historical question. When we strip away the fascinating legends and those really cool philosophical overlaps, what hard, contemporaneous evidence actually remains? Well, the academic rebuttal is quite devastating, to be honest. Mainstream historians uniformly reject the idea, pointing out a glaring lack of solid evidence. First off, there is complete silence in first-century Roman, Indian, and Buddhist texts. Nothing. Second, there are profound linguistic inconsistencies. Jesus spoke Aramaic, which is a Semitic language. There is absolutely no sign of him utilizing Sanskrit or Pali lingo in his teachings, which is exactly what we'd expect if he spent years studying the Vedas. Furthermore, archaeologists find literally zero evidence linking the Kashmir tomb to a first-century Judean. And, perhaps most damning of all, Notovich's miraculous Hemas monastery scrolls have never been seen by any recognized modern scholar, ever. Furthermore, rigorous textual critics, like the renowned biblical scholar Bart D. Ehrman, argue that Notovich's original discovery was a complete ground-up fabrication. Ehrman notes, the entire story was invented by Notovich, who earned a good deal of money and a substantial amount of notoriety for his hoax. And actually, after his claims were first published and scrutinized, some reports indicated that Notovich even confessed to the forgery. To mainstream historians, an epic, multi-year journey by a Jewish carpenter across dangerous ancient trade routes without a single piece of contemporaneous documentation, it's simply a myth. Finally, Section 6, the power of a myth, why the story endures. Yet, despite overwhelming academic rejection, the Jesus in India theory stubbornly refuses to fade away. Thanks to modern documentaries from major networks, endless internet forums, and the incredibly rapid pace of digital media, this historical what-if continues to reach massive global audiences. Algorithms are essentially breathing new life into these 19th century theories. They allow the myth to successfully leap from dusty colonial travelogues right onto our modern screens, capturing imaginations worldwide. So why does the story survive? It survives because it serves a deep, resonant, psychological purpose for us. Think about it. First, it neatly fills that incredibly frustrating 18-year biographical gap in a way that feels beautifully epic. It also perfectly harmonizes Christian, Hindu, and Buddhist philosophies into one timeline. It frames Jesus as a universal, cross-cultural spiritual seeker. Ultimately, it appeals heavily to our modern desires for a unified, interconnected, global religious narrative. And that brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this explainer.
Whether it is a forgotten historical fact or a carefully constructed colonial-era fiction, this myth leaves us pondering something pretty profound about ourselves. What does our enduring desire to connect the world's greatest spiritual teachers reveal about our own search for a universal truth? It really seems that in our search for connection, we are desperate to see the world's greatest teachers sitting at the exact same